In order to display all 24 hours of the day on this page, we're going to create a separate function. Let's go back to the editor. We will start in the timeline component. This is where we have a v4 directive which prints all those hours in a list. And now we're going to create a separate script tag in this component and create one constant which is going to hold all hours in the array. Initially this array will be empty, and down here let's create for loop which is going to iterate over all 24 hours of the day. And on every loop iteration it's gonna add one more object into this timeline items array, which will consist from only one property, hour. And after this loop runs, we will get 24 objects in timeline items array, which we can use in this v4 directive. Right away in here, we're going to destructure every element of this array, which currently has only one property, hour. We will also use this variable as a value for key attribute. And at the bottom, let's also print out this value on the screen and check out in the browser. And what we are supposed to get right now is that all 24 list items will be printed on the page, based on that local timeline items array inside of the timeline component, which we can see on the right side. And also let's make sure that all 24 list items have been printed on the page. Let's scroll down the page to the bottom. As we can see, all hours are displayed. And now, since that logic which generates all these objects that represent hours can be considered as one logical unit, we're gonna create a separate function for it. And we'll call this function generate timeline items. Let's copy constant declaration inside of this function, and right after loop runs, we're basically going to return generated timeline items array. And whenever we're gonna need to generate timeline items, we basically call this function like this. And in terms of logic, nothing has been really changed. We still can see 24 list items on our page. Let's also improve readability of this function a little bit. And the simplest thing we can do in this regard is to extract this hard-coded value 24 into a separate constant. Let's name the constant hours in a day. And right before this function is defined, we're going to define this constant with value 24. That will represent amount of hours in a day. And after that, our function has become more readable. Currently in our project we have a dedicated place where we can store all these generic functions. The file is called functions.js. Let's move this function inside of that file. Since this function is a pure JavaScript function which has nothing to do with Vue and does not use any of its specific features, we'll put this function at the end of functions.js file and export it from here. And since this function also references our new constant hours in day, we're going to place this constant inside of constants.js module. So let's grab this constant from the timeline component and move it to constants.js. As with other constants, we're gonna export this constant from here, and inside of functions.js, let's add an import for this constant. There are already quite a few constants that are imported in this file, so let's format this import a little bit by placing every constant on its own line. And finally, it's time to import generate timeline items function from the component where it will be used. That is inside of the timeline component. Right here we're adding import statement for generate timeline items function, which we import from functions.js. And in this component we use this function to generate timeline items and store it inside of timeline items constant. And we're referencing this constant right from the template inside of v4 directive. And now we got exact same result as before. All 24 items have been printed on the page. But now the underlying timeline items array that is used inside of v4 directive to print all those list items is generated dynamically by using the function which we imported from another module. And this way we separate our business logic from the components logic in order to make components leaner and more readable.